Matthew 26, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. We come now into the final section of Matthew, his betrayal, his trial, and his crucifixion, and then, of course, the conclusion to the entire book, his resurrection and the Great Commission. This chapter is focused on Jesus' betrayal. Of course, first we have the Passover meal. We have Jesus pointing ahead and talking about all of the events that will transpire. And then we have the initial trial and them finding Jesus guilty in a kind of sham trial, a mockery of justice. Within this section, we have three main characters from a narrative analysis standpoint: Jesus, his disciples, and the chief priests and elders. And that's the organization scheme I will use for our discussion, but it will also essentially turn into our moving through the chapter together. Starting out at the very beginning, one of the supreme ironies of this chapter is, with all of the intrigue of the chief priests and the elders, simultaneously, Jesus is entirely in control of the situation. Nothing surprises him. And that starts out right at the beginning of the chapter. The chapter begins, as we've talked about, with the conclusion of Jesus' words, his sermons. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, and these are the sermons or the declarations of chapters 25 all the way back to 23 or even 22. When all of this is done, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is going to be delivered up to be crucified." Jesus goes on to talk about all of the details. He's going to tell them that one of you will betray me. He will identify who that person is, he who has dipped his hand in the dish. He even points to Judas and says, "You have said so. Yes, it is you." When the betrayers are coming, Jesus rises and he says to them, "The hour is at hand, the Son of Man is betrayed. Rise, let us be going. My betrayer is at hand." When Judas walks to him, Jesus says, "Friend, do what you came to do." And he speaks to them recognizing that the scriptures will be fulfilled, that all of this has taken place, that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Now, that's Jesus' complete control of the situation. And if you work through those descriptions and those details, you realize that Jesus has told them already the when, how, by whom he will be betrayed, and even the disciples' response and what will come after his betrayal. I mean, all of this has already been prophesied in Matthew, and even it comes again in this chapter. It's all a known thing. The ironic aspect of that is when you look at all of the secrecy and the intrigue of those who are trying to betray him, and they're trying to keep it silent, so that the chapter itself starts off with this irony. The chief priests and the elders are gathered secretly in the palace, and they plotted in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. And they have plans, no, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. And the plans working with Judas and all of those tricky, intriguing details to make it work. Meanwhile, Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and he's telling them exactly what will transpire. The irony of the story, then, some people think they're being clever. Jesus already knows the entire outcome. Now, standing in between those events, however, there is another narrative pericope, another narrative section that shows you just how aware and just how settled the coming reality is. Jesus is at Bethany at the house of Simon the leper. And just to pause for a second and understand the geography of this. These locations are very close. Jerusalem and Bethany are probably a mile or maybe 2 kilometers away from each other. And they're arranged kind of like Bethphage that we saw earlier, just across the Kidron Valley, a little bit more of a walk, but a mile and a half at the most. So the distance between them is low enough, small enough, that Jesus is probably actually traveling back and forth between the two locations. He's probably sleeping and staying in Bethany, and then he's returning to Jerusalem during the day. In any case, and however this is, when Jesus was at Bethany, staying in the house of Simon the leper, that itself should probably call our attention to assume we're probably looking at a past healing here, something Jesus did, because why else would you have a leper who's able to host people? A woman comes with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. She poured it on his head as he reclined at table. And so that you have a grasp even of what this refers to, people have been able to excavate flasks like this. So this is alabaster. It's a precious or semi-precious stone, and it can be carved. And then the perfume can be put in and sealed. But the neck of the vase is thin enough and brittle enough that when it's ready to be used, it's just broken. And the amount or the worth, the value of this ointment is astronomical. We have no way of knowing how this woman acquired it, but we're probably looking at a year's worth of wages or more. This is a lot of money. And she takes it and she pours it all out in an extravagant act, pouring it out upon Jesus. The disciples' response to this is, why this waste? This could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor. We could have done some good with this. It's a waste. Jesus, aware, asks, why do you trouble this woman? She has done a beautiful thing. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. I tell you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Passing note, we're talking about it right now, 2,000 years later. And a couple of details that make this significant. Jesus is still a friend of sinners, a leper in the household of a leper. And we find out as we put the other gospels together, this is a woman also with a very checkered background. And putting those pieces together, then Jesus is not afraid, even in the week of his death, to associate with people who in the past have been tainted. Jesus is a friend of sinners. It's also striking that he is still predicting his burial. He's talking about his death, which is only days away now. And he just comments, she has done to prepare me for burial. I'm about to die. Only a few days from now, we know. He accepts as well his high value. This is an odd thing to say, but to pour out this extravagant amount of money, and for Jesus to say of it, well, this was a beautiful thing. It was worth it. You always have the poor with you. You won't always have me. This would be arrogant for anyone else to say. But Jesus says it, and it's true. And finally, just notice that Jesus predicts the preaching of the gospel in the entire world. It is to say, after his death and his resurrection, he's telling them that the news of what has happened and even what will happen, his dying and rising again, is going to spread worldwide. He's talking about events after he has already died. At this point, it feels rather distant into the future of the story. Jesus already knows what's going to happen. That takes me to the next major narrative event in this chapter, and this is the issue of the Passover. So we can recognize that across this chapter you've had a strong reference to the Passover already, and it's reminding us of the overlap between Jesus' ministry this week and his death even, and the old Jewish tradition of the Passover going all the way back to the Exodus. So just notice the number of times we read this word. You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming. Where will you eat the Passover? I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. They prepared the Passover. And all of that is to say that Jesus' death has now, in the providence of God, been orchestrated to come and to be perfectly synced with the Passover. Jesus Christ, who is the Lamb, will be offered, and he is the Passover. a couple of theological links you have to know about in understanding this Passover. Number one, you should be aware and recognize that the Passover language and the Lord's Supper, which Jesus Christ is about to institute, are a significant critical echo or inauguration of the new covenant. And that's right here in the passage. Jesus took a cup, and when he drank it, he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Jesus is beginning, he's inaugurating, he's starting the new covenant through his blood. Luke uses that exact language. There's more, of course. The Passover is poured out for the many. And if you notice that language, poured out for many, it sounds like Isaiah. The one, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, will be a sacrifice so that the many can live. This also, of course, links backward to the Passover, and we've seen this several times. Earlier, we recognized the language of the Passover. Jesus is going to eat the Passover. I will keep the Passover. And noting, of course, that this is on the first day of unleavened bread. This is earlier than the actual normal expected celebration of the Passover. So he's doing something different. And yet, this Lord's Supper is kind of the fulfillment and the completion of the Passover that came before. All of the expectations that were built into the Passover ceremony, Jesus will now fulfill. Paul will later say, Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed. But notice that there's also a future aspect. Jesus tells them, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine again until the day I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. The Lord's Supper looks both backwards to the Passover, but it also looks forward to the coming victory, the time when we will eat together with him in the marriage supper of the Lamb. And we can find the fuller explanation of this in the epistles. 1 Corinthians actually functions like a commentary on this idea. 1 Corinthians 11:25, a passage that we often use, telling us this, that in respect to Jesus' sacrifice and celebrated in the Lord's Supper. When he took the cup after supper, he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." It has a backwards looking component. Remember, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And just to take these pieces and put some of them together, let's recognize the rich significance of what Jesus instituted here. He's taken the bread, and his comment that the bread is broken, like his body will be broken. He's taken the cup, and he's identified it as symbolic of his blood poured out on their behalf. But if you understand the Passover meal, the centerpiece of the Passover meal is the lamb. There is no lamb after this. The Lord's Supper continues on, and we have the cup, we have the bread. Where is the lamb? Jesus Christ, our Passover, has been offered. There's a part missing, and it's him. But there is no need for a sacrifice, because the sacrifice has already been made, and that points into this rich future. The marriage supper of the Lamb, the expectation that a day will come when we will eat with him again. We call this sometimes the Last Supper. It's not. There's a supper coming. There's a meal coming in which we will sit down with Jesus again, commemorating, remembering what he did, victorious, celebrating his victory. All of these are highlights or theological reflections on who Jesus is, his glory, his power, his knowledge, that he's sovereignly in control of all of this, that he's worthy of pouring out great expense, that his burial is coming soon, but that he will be victorious because his life will be laid down for the many, for the salvation of those who trust in him. But I told you there were three characters, and the second major character of this section is the disciples. Now, what follows right after this is that Jesus proceeds together with the disciples, and they go to Gethsemane. And we see a pattern in Gethsemane of Jesus struggling, his great sorrow, and his great awareness of what is about to come. You remember the account of this. Jesus praying and his disciples supposed to or intended to join with him. Jesus, with full knowledge of what is about to come, is very sorrowful. He says, sorrowful even to death, sorrowful and troubled. He asks that they watch with him, and you remember this kind of pattern where he says that instruction to them initially. He goes and he returns, and he found them sleeping. So again, the second time he went away and he prayed again, the same thing, just asking the Father for help as he faces this. He returns and he finds them sleeping. Leaving them again, he goes, he prays the third time. And when he comes again, he finds them still sleeping. And the striking thing about this is twofold. First, the disciples have no appreciation of what's about to come. They have no appreciation of the weightiness of the temptation and the sorrow that is about to befall them. But that actually points us to something thicker that's going on here. And notice that Jesus is not just praying for himself. But if you watch the pattern, he's also praying on their behalf, and he's concerned on their behalf. So he says to them to watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he's talking to them of their need to be prepared. Why is that? And what's the point of that? Is Jesus just looking for someone to be with him? Well, I think there's more. And if you go now backwards through the pattern of the passage, you're going to find a pattern here with Jesus preparing them for what is about to come. He's telling them and warning them that they're about to face great temptation. He warns them, you will all fall away because of me this night. All will fall away. The sheep of the flock will be scattered, which is taken from the Old Testament. All will fall away, Peter says, but not me. And Jesus' answer is, no, you will. In fact, you will deny me 3 times. And Jesus gives very specific expectations down to the timing. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. All of the disciples said the same, we hear. And so Jesus is recognizing that the disciples also face great temptation. Part of the beauty of what's happening in this passage is that Jesus is praying. But he's not only praying for himself, he's also praying for them. He's praying that they will not fall away. And Jesus has every reason to focus on himself. All face temptations together. Jesus has told Peter the warning about what will happen. Who's in great danger here? Who's concerned? Who's praying? All of them should be praying. Only Jesus remains faithful and overcomes. I'd like to show you a pattern that stands very strong across this entire section. And this is the pattern of falling away, but also the pattern of denying. And it's the pattern or the emphasis that this section of Matthew is making about the disciples. It's the failure of the disciples in the face of all that went on. Jesus tells them, you will all fall away, though you all fall away. You will deny me. No, I will not deny you, Peter says. And then the sad outcome in verse 56. Then all the disciples left him and fled. And you remember the account later, Peter following comes, but when he's asked, he denies, and he denies. And then he recalls that Jesus told him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Jesus warned them that they would be tempted to fall away. Jesus prayed for them that they would remain faithful. And there's a parallel drama that runs alongside of Jesus and his suffering. And it's the temptation of the disciples. In this entire scenario, only Jesus remained faithful. This is, of course, part of the point. Jesus is abandoned by everyone else. But I want to point out that when I talked about the 3 characters, Jesus, the disciples, and the scribes and the Pharisees, there is one individual that kind of stands between them, and that's Judas. Is Judas one of the disciples, or is Judas one of the Pharisees? And of course, Judas joins together with Jesus' opponents. He betrays Jesus. That is a critical part in terms of just the words and the themes in this chapter. One of the major emphases of this section, that Judas is a betrayer. It's the emphasis that Jesus was not just randomly taken to die, but Jesus was betrayed by one of his own. And you can see this pattern as you go through. The Son of Man will be betrayed to be crucified. They sought to betray him. One of you will betray me. The one will betray me, he who dips his hand with me. The Son of Man will be betrayed. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed. And here is the hand that betrays me. And there is the one that gave him the sign and betrayed him. It's a point that's actually drawn even from the Psalms, even from the Old Testament, that it is one of Jesus' own, a relationship, one close to him, that turns on him. And it's the ultimate indignity. It's a betrayal of trust. Why did Judas betray Jesus? We could give various reasons. We might suggest or assume that it was because he wanted the money. Perhaps he thought, and we see later some details that lend some credence or possibility, perhaps he thought that Jesus would be found innocent. We don't know his motivations. And in fact, to try to guess at his motivations might run the danger of trying to make the betrayal sound logical and intelligent. It was insanity. But why even the need to seek a betrayal? Couldn't the Pharisees have just taken Jesus by force? And this is a helpful insight if you go back and you remember Herod and his fear to kill John the Baptist, because the crowds trusted and loved John. And you see even here the editorial comment in verse 3 that they were afraid to take Jesus, lest the crowds would fight back. There is the awareness throughout that Jesus is beloved, and that the crowds themselves know that Jesus is innocent. Which takes me now to the chief priests and the elders. They're seeking for an opportunity to take Jesus because they know they cannot take him publicly. They have to do something surreptitious. There are interesting details that just help us envision a little bit of this picture. Earlier, I showed you this model of the temple complex and a guess at what it probably would have looked like at the time of Jesus. The Sanhedrin would have met, as far as we know, in this building. So they're gathering together, we read at the beginning of the chapter, and they're seeking to form a plan for how to secretly take Jesus. Caiaphas is the leader among them, and you can walk through the chapter and see Caiaphas's involvement throughout as a major figure in all of this. Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Caiaphas is a very interesting individual. If you walk through the New Testament's account of Caiaphas and just form a kind of brief biography of him, there are some really striking details about him. For instance, John records that Caiaphas as high priest spoke wisely. When they attempted or when they struggled to know what to do with Jesus, then the answer was him speaking to his fellow authorities. You don't understand the reality that it's better that one man should die for the people and not that the whole nation should perish. John comments on this, that being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation and even for the world, not understanding what he was saying. And we actually have found, it's been excavated, the box that held Caiaphas's bones. It's called an ossuary. And after a person was buried, then later their bones would be gathered and taken. And it's a highly decorated box. It has the name Caiaphas on the side of it. Caiaphas is recognized among those who study these things, and believers or unbelievers alike, as an actual historical figure. So we're talking about a real individual here, with real motivations and real concerns, that he's thinking about all of this. And it's helpful to recognize these realities. But part of the emphasis of this chapter, and part of the tragedy of it, in how Matthew has recorded it, is that they're treating Jesus like a common criminal. I mean, you work through the chapter and you follow the pattern that they were going to arrest Jesus, that he was going to be delivered over, other language for arrest, that they were going to seize him, that they sought to capture him. And Jesus actually calls this out. Have you come out against me as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple and teaching, and you never seized me. He calls out their hypocrisy, but he also tells them the reason. All of this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. They take Jesus, who has done no wrong, and they arrest and seize him like a common criminal. If you walk through the trial, it's very evident in this section that this is nothing but a sham trial. The chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus. And that's included those words, false testimony, in recognition that there's no attempt at justice here. This is not a trial where they're trying to find the righteous outcome. Many false witnesses came forward, and at last they found someone who would come forward. Two people who would agree. Other Gospels tell us that though they found witnesses, the witnesses would disagree with one another on details. But they could at least say this together, that this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And the entire point of this chapter is over and over to emphasize Jesus' innocence. We'll see in the next chapter all the details that affirm this and make it clear. I'd like to highlight here one of the ironies. The charge against Jesus was that if they destroyed his temple, he would rebuild it in 3 days. We learn elsewhere that Jesus was, of course, referring to the temple of his body. And the irony of this trial is that that is the charge, and they're about to do that very thing. They're about to kill him. And Jesus will rise again 3 days later. The very charge that they use to kill him is the very thing that brings about and fulfills this prophecy. Jesus remains silent against all their charges, and the high priest demands of him, I adjure you, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus' answer to him is drawn directly from Daniel 7, the Son of Man passage, where the Son of Man climactically comes before the Ancient of Days and receives power and dominion and authority over all things. I tell you, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven, fulfilling both Daniel 7 and Psalm 110. And in rage then, he declares that Jesus has uttered blasphemy, that there is no further need of witnesses. If you recognize, however, what Jesus has just said, in so many ways, he has just made a claim to nothing less than deity. If Jesus' words are not true, it is blasphemy. But what Jesus spoke is entirely true and right. Let's take then the conclusions or the summaries from everything that we've seen in this chapter. First, we can see that Jesus stands alone. He's forgotten, abandoned, denied by his friends, his disciples. He's betrayed by one of his own. And he is abandoned by justice, by government, and wrongly brought to die like a common criminal. We're supposed to see in him the sacrifice of true innocence. The Psalms will repeatedly talk about suffering even though one is innocent and deserves none of this. The righteous sufferer. Jesus is the ultimate righteous sufferer. But more than this, we are to see in the response of all of these, the disciples, the Pharisees, Judas, our own selves. I have turned away from him. By my sin, I am responsible for his death. I have betrayed and denied him. And he did all of this because he loved me. I'm going to conclude this chapter and summarize it for us by reading Isaiah 53. And Isaiah 53, I would argue, is functioning like a kind of a commentary on this passage, a commentary on Jesus' death, remarkably a commentary before it happened. Isaiah 53, and the beautiful lens through which we ought to understand everything we just studied together. Who has believed what he has heard from us? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. But why? Why all of this sorrow? Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted, but he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was silent, remember. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Why all of this suffering? It was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. And there's victory coming. I will divide with him a portion with the many. He shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. This is the sacrifice that Jesus made for you. This was the cost of your redemption, the cost of your life. Jesus went through this knowingly and willingly because he loved you.